Okay. All right. Now it's all set. Okay. So, yes. Shall we start? Okay. So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Yes Story Lab. And I'm so excited to have this amazing guest. Well, I saw him 2 years ago. We were in the same like online event, like a workshop as a presenters. And when I saw his Cinderella, I was like, wow, I loved it. And then this summer at NSN conference in Georgia, I met him in person finally, and we chat. And I was like, "Could you please come to your story lab?" And then he kindly said yes. So we have him here. So our presenter, Cooper Brown, grew up in Boulder, Colorado, right? And has received national recognition for his storytelling, including the J.J. Renault Emerging Artist Award, a leader in virtual storytelling. His tales prove that fairy tales can be funny, dark, and full of heart. And did you know that he was a professional theater technician on 3,000, 2,000, 3,000 seats, big theater, which presents opera, musical, and big events. So he's professional, like lighting designer, and he does audio too. So yeah, he's really multi-talented. So please welcome our presenter, Cooper Brown.
Thank you, everyone. It's really lovely to be here. Um, it was really lovely to talk with Karen this summer about bringing this workshop. I've gotten to do this a couple of times this year. And just a quick show of hands, has anybody here taken some version of this workshop before? Great, you got one. There we go. You're fine. I've been trying to grow this workshop such that someone can come back to it and still get something lovely out of it. So I would love to, Karen, if you've got an opinion after the workshop, I'd love to hear that. So some things up front. My name's Cooper Brown. I use he, him pronouns. If you see my eyes flicking over to the side, it's because that's where my notes are. I've been a professional storyteller for about 11 years now, and my work is primarily focused on fairy and folk tales. Many of you might know me from a show that I run called Fairy Tale Variations, which is the best thing that ever happened to me because of the pandemic. My partner and I, my storytelling partner and I, Rachel Ann Harding, decided to get some friends together and all do a version of a fairy tale, and 150 people showed up. So we did another one, and 230 people showed up. So we kept doing them, and we're about to do our 26th next weekend. So I like fairy tales. I like playing with fairy tales. And so that's what we're going to talk about here. Please, if you have questions, please ask them. We do only have 90 minutes, but there is both the raise hand button and there is the just literally type it into the chat or raise your hand and cough. You know, we'll get it all there. So if you do have questions, if something that I'm saying isn't making sense, please ask, because I would rather not just run my mouth and I'll have you nod along and then say, what was he talking about? So, you know, please do ask questions. There shouldn't be any trigger warnings for this workshop. I mean, fairy tales can get dark, and we'll allude to that. But you're all adults. If you feel comfortable having your cameras on, that's great. I love to be able to see people's faces. If this is Zoom, though, if you need to walk away, walk away. You know, this is Zoom, where you're in your house. Please take care of yourselves. The one thing in the world of trigger warnings, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, is I, particularly when I say fairy tale, I tell out of what we might call the Western canon. I tell mostly Brothers Grimm stories. I tell some Irish stories. I do a little bit of Middle Eastern and a little bit of Japanese and Chinese stories. But the core of my work is through the Brothers Grimms mostly. Now, this is a yes storytelling lab. So I'm assuming that most people here are interested in telling to children. And so I was going to, and I'm seeing some heads nod. That's where we are. So I'm going to focus this on children. I tell mostly to adults, but I think many of the things I'm about to talk about are going to play to both sides. And this workshop, in many ways, can be two different things. One is simply the idea of how do we bring fairy tales to life? Because if any of you, and I'm sure you all have just read the Brothers Grimm's out loud, it is so dry. It is so terribly weird and dry. And I was read those stories as a child and I loved them as a child, but then progressively I'm like, this is just weird. And the more I believe that we can bring stories to life, that we can tell them in a way that is engaging to whether it's a 4-year-old or an 80-year-old, right? That we can bring these stories to life. And then a lot of what I do also is what we might call twisting or fracturing fairy tales. Now, that's a game that young folks might not understand, but I have a good friend. He tells to third and fourth graders, and he tells Cinderella about a pair of cowboy boots and a farm boy, right? That resetting of a story is a very classic thing we do. And so we're gonna talk about twisting fairy tales, and I'm happy to dig into that more. But my thought right here is mostly in the how do we breathe life into these stories. So the one little bit of sort of, I don't know, maybe a little trigger warning, right, is the cultural appropriation. It's a real thing. I'm real white. I personally do not tell Native American stories. I do not tell African stories because I'm real white. The Asian stories that I tell, I spend a great deal of time digging into to try to make sure they are as traditional as they can be. And the Middle Eastern stories that I do as well, there's one gender swapped Middle Eastern story that I tell. So my big thing in all of this is be aware of what you're doing as you play with these tales. And the thing is there are actually no rules. There are no fairy tale police. There are copyright lawyers. So if you are telling literary work, picture books that actually are copywritten, that's its own separate thing. But one of the things that we as storytellers, I think, sometimes forget is that these stories can be old and beautiful, and also sometimes have morals that we didn't realize were in them and that we weren't really into telling. I'll talk about this later, but I did a lot of work with Shakespeare over my life. I worked 11 years for the Colorado Shakespeare Festival. And The Taming of the Shrew is basically a story about how to gaslight and abuse your wife until she's subservient to you. And that's King Thrushbeard is the traditional that we might talk about there. And if you're going to tell that story, I'd be aware of what you're doing with it. But again, in that, it's all just be aware of what you're doing. And that fundamentally, again, there aren't fairy tale police. But if you take a story that you've heard and you tell it verbatim, you may later learn that someone wrote that story. I heard a storyteller I really respect tell a story by J. O'Callahan, The Bubble. And Jay has, for the last 40 years, not given anybody permission to tell his stories. And I know that. And so that colors my hearing of that story a little bit. So with all of that out of the way, fairy tales. So why are we doing this? Let's start there. Why are we asking this question? And I think this is a valid one to ask. I personally love fairy tales. I grew up on them. I think they are deep and they are beautiful and they draw on archetypes. And there's often a shared story understanding in your audience, even by grades 3 and 4. Pretty much the kids have all seen Disney. They all have a reference point. And so if you start resetting Cinderella or Snow White, they know what you're doing and they can play along with it, right? That we have this shared cultural understanding of stories. I also find this is really fun. You can say, do y'all want to hear the story that Disney took that from? Or especially with older kids, high schoolers especially, can I tell you the story that Disney didn't want you to hear? That high schoolers are such a weird age group, and I love them. I love telling high schoolers because high schoolers are dealing with a lot of really big things. They all have way too many feelings, and they're all falling in love, and their hormones are off the charts. And some percentage of them are about to make a choice about whether to go into the military. And so there's a lot going on with them. And I think that these fairy tales especially have a lot to talk to that age range, that you can talk about things like war and death and love and sex, and those kids will eat it up. So, there are really old versions of these stories. The oldest version of Sleeping Beauty that I have the literary version of is from Vasily, 1643, Talia, the Sun and the Moon. And this is where she wakes up with twins. The prince doesn't kiss her. Now, there's a whole lot you could do with high schoolers with that story. That's a big question, right? But also in fairy tales, we're able to say something like once upon a time there was a girl whose father was a bear. And there are some students in the audience that are going to start nodding along with that. They know that father. They've met their dad. They know that story. But fairy tale as a genre, to me, lets us really paint in bright colors and broad brushstrokes. Fairy tales are the only place that I know that you can literally kill evil with a sword. You can overthrow evil emperors. You can throw a ring into a volcano and destroy all the evil in the world by doing so. That's the Lord of the Rings, right? That's pretty powerful stuff. So I think fairy tales can be really big. We can talk about really, really big stuff, but also I just like fairy tales. And when you read the originals, they can be really, really stuffy and dry and boring. And so when I start playing with fairy tales, I love that we get to bring them up. So when I talk about fairy tale, so what is a fairy tale? Fairy tales are a style or a genre of storytelling, specifically involving magic, wonder, and enchantment. Now, there is the folk process, this populist process of storytelling where Charles Perrault writes Little Red Riding Hood, probably from a traditional story he's heard, but that's the first written version we have. It's written for an upper class French audience, and then it filters down and starts being told as a traditional story again. And then we get story collectors that pick up versions of that story that we can trace back to Perrault, but have evolved through the folk process. I took a workshop a long time ago that was a 3-hour workshop. We had time to really introduce everybody, say why everybody's here. I would love to do that, but it would take up a bunch of our time doing it. So, and 2 of the people in that workshop said, well, I read my children the Brothers Grimm's, and they asked, what did the big bad wolf do next? So the big bad wolf and Prince Charming went on an adventure together. That's the folk process. That is the folk process. We are part of the folk process. If you want to look at the folk process right now in work, young adult fiction, like the Percy Jackson books, there are these places where people are playing with myth and fairy tale and reshaping it. It's Who Killed Cinderella? Who Killed Sleeping Beauty? A friend of mine just read that. Like, there are all of these books in, especially the young adult milieu, that authors know that we can play with these stories. What we're doing isn't new. But thinking about it as part of the folk process helps me to think about where are these stories coming from. And we talk about that there are literary stories, which is a story that someone has written down, as opposed to a story that has developed through the folk process. And fairy tales can be either. Charles Perrault, the late 1600s, he writes them all. They all have little rhyming couplets of the moral at the end to tell you what you should have remembered about the story. Little girls, there are wolves in the forest. I don't know the exact rhyme. The Grimms, 1812 is the first edition. They're folk tales, though they do a lot of editing. We generally use the 1857 edition. Now, in the 1843 edition, they include Hans Christian Andersen's Princess and the Pea as a folk story. Hans Christian Andersen wrote that story. That's a literary story. All of HCA's stories are literary stories. He wrote them all. 1835. So and yet The Little Mermaid, we consider a folk story. We consider that a classic fairy tale that was written in the 1830s. So Joseph Jacobs, 1890s, His collections are much more folk in the telling, where Andrew Lang, which is the colored fairy books, again, the 1890s, have a much more literary and high language feel to them. They're not sort of the way, if we're sitting in front of a fire, I might tell you a story. They're they have more life in them. They're bigger. And then we have people. Leclerc Gowan Alliger was a writer in, I think, the 50s and the 60s. She wrote under the pen name Sorsa Nick Leodes, Thistle in Time, a bunch of Scottish folk tale collections, except she's the first time I can trace most of the stories she writes. So the question is, do we believe her when she says, I was told this story somewhere in Scotland, because that's what all of the introductions say, but she doesn't tell where or who. And then the Beekeeper and the Bewitched Hare, that's the first time that story appears, is in Thistle and Time. I have chosen to believe her because I really like that story and I would like to tell it. Also, I think it's her niece is who owns the copyrights right now to all of her stories, and that woman is not interested at all in who's telling those stories. So I'm happy about that. So again, where are these stories from? That I sometimes write stories that feel like a fairy tale. If you follow Fairy Tale Variations, this last spring, we did Beauty and the Beast. I wrote a story called The Soldier and the Beast, which feels like a fairy tale, but is my own writing. So again, it's all muddy. Fairy tale is a genre. Fairy tale is a style of story that involves magic, wonder. Oh, sorry, I realized I was supposed to do this. I realized I should have done this at the beginning. If you would like the handout before it goes out tomorrow, sorry, you can hear my dog in the background. That link right there has the handout. I know some folks like to follow along in the handout, so I'm sorry I didn't post that at the beginning, but there that is. So, as I said at the beginning, there are some of these stories, sort of the stories of yesteryear, that just because it's old doesn't mean it's good. The Comedy of Errors, another Shakespeare, is predicated on two very, very funny things. One, twins are really, really funny, so let's have two pairs of twins. And second, beating your servants is the most hilarious thing we can do on stage. The second doesn't play so well anymore. It's a hard show to do because, again, huge amounts of the comedy are predicated on beating servants is funny. There's a Grimm story called The Bird, the Mouse, and the Bratwurst, which is about a bird, a mouse, and a bratwurst who all lived happily together. And one day the bird gets uppity and decides they should switch which tasks they're doing, and everyone dies. It's a pretty thinly veiled, men have their work and women have their work, and if you change it up, everybody dies. I think it can be a funny story if you present it right, but told straight, maybe not. And then we get into it about sometimes there are things that we forget in the originals. This is my creepiest fairy tale fact that I have learned this year. We were doing Snow White in January, and I went back and I reread the originals. And does anybody know how old Snow White is in both the 1812 and the later editions, when her mother in the first editions and her stepmother in the second editions orders her murdered? It's less than that, Christine. Christine said 9. She's 7. She's 7 years old when her stepmother decides that she's more beautiful and she should be killed. And then, because there is no canonical passage of time, because fairy tales often don't have canonical passage of time, it could be argued that the prince falls in love with a 7-year-old corpse. And now this story has gone into a way that, if your kids are following you, just got real, real dark, and that probably wasn't your intention. So going back to them and just, what are they? Remembering what they say, right? We generally remember that the stepsisters in the Grimm Cinderella cut off their heels and their toe to fit into the shoes, but we also forget that their eyes get pecked out by birds at the wedding, because Cinderella has these like flock of birds that are her magic birds. So, fairy tales are weird. So, in all of this, I like this metaphor, and this metaphor is what the name of the workshop is about. I think of the collected fairy tales we have as freeze-dried soup. Somewhere along the line, there was a beautiful recipe that someone tried to write down grandma's recipe. And what we eventually got was powdered broth and little dry pieces of corn and like maybe some noodles. And I think that back there was a really, really good pot of soup. But we don't have the recipe for that pot of soup. And so, how do we get that recipe? That, again, we've all had that moment. We've read a fairy tale and it's hit us. We've all had that. Something's hit us. Something in that story has spoken to us. But then you go and read that fairy tale to someone else, and they're like, really? Like, that's real dry. It's real weird. So, in that, right, how do we breathe life into it? How do we bring it back? How do we reconstruct that beautiful pot of soup? And so, the first part there is just trying to figure out the recipe, trying to figure out who wrote this down. Now, most of our collectors were middle-class men who went out to collect the stories of the folk. Sort of. The Grimms mostly collected from a group of middle-class women called the Wild Sisters. They did not collect from little old ladies, living in the woods. They were women of approximately their own age. There are many of these collectors that made the stories palatable. The early Brothers Grimm stories, Rapunzel asks her who she calls her mother, the witch. She says, "My dress is getting tight and I don't understand why." She's pregnant. That's what happened. That gets cut in the later edition. The early edition, they're mothers that get turned into stepmothers. These stories get changed by the people that collected them. Things get left out. Now, also, we can argue, sometimes we read the stories and there's like a jump. And that might just be that he had to go find more ink and she just kept talking, right? Like, and like crib notes as quick as you could, but you're like digging for more ink. So we didn't, the literary stories, Perrault, we understand he wrote it. He wrote what we have. But especially the collected stories, you get little bits and pieces, and then we have these fascinating things. I don't think anybody has ever told me in one of the original, it might be Perrault's version of Little Red Riding Hood, her mother says you can take the path of pins or you can take the path of needles. I don't know what that is, but it sounds cool, right? That's cool. You could play an entire story just off of that sounded cool. What did that mean? And then you get, so the Grimms do publish Little Red Cap, which is their version of Little Red Riding Hood, with a big asterisk that says this is a French story, but it's really popular, so we're publishing it anyway. Except in their version, it goes from being Le Petit Chaperon Rouge, the Little Red Riding Cloak, which is a very upper class garment. It's a specific garment, to Little Red Cap, which this is being collected in the 18aughts and the 1810s, which is about 20 years after the French Revolution. Red caps meant something. This is also a time that Hesse is occupied and being run by a puppet government of Napoleon. It's being occupied by French troops. Hessites are being sent off to fight in the French armies. The brothers are actually working for the Margrave of Hesse Landgrave. Sorry, I'm blanking on that. But so they write this story in which Little Red Cap is attacked by a wolf. At the time period, wolf is a derogatory term being used for French soldiers in Hesse. And she is saved by a woodsman or a hunter, Jäger, which is the popular name for local German constabulary. This is the first time we see a hunter or a woodsman in any of these stories. They added some stuff to that story. They did. So how do I know this stuff? Research. And this is finding the recipe. This to me is finding the recipe. I start on Wikipedia, honestly, and you scroll down to the bottom and it says see also, and then I click all of those. And you get a bunch of stuff there. All of this is in the handout. There's direct links there. Oh, and sorry, I'm reading oh, lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Uh, Pitt.edu, which is the University of Pittsburgh, has a really, really lovely collection, and they're grouped in the I'm blanking on the name. The fairy tale uh, themes, tropes. It's in there. So we talk about. Sorry, Mary, you just said it, but I can't hear you. You can unmute. Can you? No worries. Oh, there we go.
Motifs.
Motifs. There. Thank you. Thank you. I'll remember words. I ostensibly talk a lot. So the fairy tale motifs, right? I was just looking up. We're about to do a ghost story show, so I've been looking at ghosts. I got down the path of looking for death, which is often the Pardoner's Tale from Chaucer, and there's a whole bunch in that of three fellows that go looking to kill death and all die in the process. Sacred Texts, which is a very bad website, but has an immense amount of information, and just is text of huge numbers of books in public domain that are searchable. And so sometimes if you're really bored, and you're looking for stories about whiskey, you go type in whiskey and you read through like 10 pages, and I found one of my favorite stories I tell. Project Gutenberg has a lot of these stories in the originals. You can go back, and that finding of, okay, where did this story come from? I just ended up reading a bunch of Lady Gregory's writing, contemporary of W.B. Yeats. So I like to go back as far back as I can, see where the story started, and see how it's morphed since then. And now and again, you find really lovely little tidbits in the old ones, and then you sort of get to pick and choose the version you want to create. Read a lot. Listen to people tell. We've all had that. We've heard someone tell an amazing story, and I hope what you did is you walked up to them and said, where did that come from? And sometimes someone says, I wrote it. And you say, that's awesome. And sometimes you can ask them for permission to tell it. And sometimes they'll give it to you. But that's again, it's their work. And sometimes they say, oh, go find this book. Or that's so-and-so story that I got from so-and-so, and you can trace it back and you can find, where did that story come from? I love the storyteller Facebook group. One of my favorite stories I ever tell, Kathleen and the Greyhound, came because I typed into that, I'm looking for stories about greyhounds, and Liz Weir sent me the title of a book and said, you have to buy this book, read this story. And it's stunning. And then also I must give a shout out to my friend, Dr. Changa Zalka. Changa writes a blog called The Multicolored Diary. She does incredible work. The one that I've linked there, she does a thing every year. I think it's in April that she writes one post for every letter of the alphabet over the course of the month. And she's done, this link there is for diversity. You want stories about pregnant heroines. You want stories about good stepmothers. You want stories about old heroes. All of these sort of tropes that we don't think exist in fairy tales, and Changa's like, oh, they do. This woman decided to read a fairy tale collection from every country on earth that she could get a collection from. She knows a lot. And if you're nice and you email her questions, she emails you stuff back. And then sometimes you get into a relationship where I worked at a university, and she would text me and she would say, Cooper, there's a book at your university. I need photos of these 3 pages. Perfect. So this is how we play the game. So now we have a recipe. What do we got? We got through 25 minutes of Cooper rambling about fairy tales. Okay. So now we have a recipe. We have an idea, a framework of the story we want to tell. So what do we do with it? The first thing that I would say, and again, I'm going to keep using this cooking metaphor, is just make the recipe with really good ingredients. Don't just pour hot water on freeze-dried soup. That will still be a good meal. It will still fill you up. But if you go and you boil bones and you make stock and you go get carrots from your local farmer's market and you peel and you chop them and you go get good beef from the local CSA and you just make the soup with really, really good stock. We'll talk about how that works in a moment, right? That just to me, that is this, how do we breathe life into these stories? How do we tell these stories in a way that makes us feel like we want to be there? Personal stories are often easier for people because we were there. We remember what the room smelt like. We remember what our own fear smelt like. We remember how the lights flickered. We don't have that in the fairy tales, but it can be in the fairy tales. And so I just want to say, too, that you don't have to go farther than this. If all you do from this workshop is you add a little more flavor to your stories, I will believe my work is done. You don't have to go farther. And also, you have permission to do this. Copyright and your own morals notwithstanding. There are people that I met that they're like, we must do the Brothers Grimm's the way they were written down. And first of all, which version? There were a lot of versions. But why? Those guys have been dead a really long time. They edited those stories. That wasn't the way those stories were told to them. So why do we have to tell them that way? We don't have to do that. But there is this weird thing that sometimes people are really like, that story must be told the way it was. Now, again, if I am telling stories from a culture that is not sort of where my ancestors derive from, I try to be really respectful to that culture because I understand what lines I might be crossing with European fairy tales, but I don't know as well the lines that I might be crossing with a Japanese fairy tale. I love Japanese fairy tales, but I do a lot of research when I tell them. So, how do we do this? How do you breathe life into these stories? So, these are things that many other workshops can talk about. If anybody's really interested in one of these, we could spend the rest of the workshop just digging into one of these, but I'm going to sort of go through them. And there's one we're going to really focus on. Now, the first of these is the classic show, don't tell. They walked into the room. The air smelt like jasmine, and in the flicker of the candle lights, he could see the outline of a man behind the curtain. Those are two different phrases that basically say the same thing. But one of them puts you in this space. That the more that you are able to show and not tell, the more you bring your audience into the room. And this, for me, is specifically about senses other than sight. Sight is great. I love sight. But if you can talk about the way the room smells, can Little Red Riding Hood smell the wolf? Like, we've all smelled wet dog. Like, what does wolf smell like? What season is it? How does the air feel? Is the air warm? Is the air heavy? Is the air cold? What's the quality of the light in the room? That we talk about the ball. So how's the ball lit? How's it lit? What world are we in? What is the tech level of this Cinderella's fairy tale world? Because if it is lit with candles, there's going to be smoke. If it's lit with gaslight, so we're in the 1800s, but fairy tale worlds exist in a lot of places. Gaslight has a very specific color to it. If it's lit by fairy magic, that's probably going to feel weird to mortals. Remember, one of the things I love about Jack and the Beanstalk, this is one of the stories that broke my mind open about this, is Jack climbs up a beanstalk and looks down at a countryside. This is something we've all done from an airplane. We all know what this is like. But this is at a time period that no one would have ever had a vision like this. The idea of looking down and seeing people like ants, and there's your cathedral, and there's the castle, and it's tiny. What's that like? What's that like when you have never had any context for an experience like that ever in your life? And then Jack gets up to the clouds, and first of all, clouds are weird. Like, even in Magic World, clouds probably don't feel like grass. Mine, he bounces along because bouncing is fun. And then we get to a giant's house. Now, if this house is actually built for giants, we have to think about how tall Jack is in comparison to those giants. If Jack comes up to approximately the giant's knee, each step of the giant's front door is going to come up to about Jack's sternum, or higher depending on how old Jack is at that moment, which means Jack is going to have to do sort of pull-ups just to get himself up the steps. And then, how does he ring the knocker? Well, in my version, he crack climbs up the door and then sort of swings himself back and forth on the knocker. Then we get into the fact that the giant counts gold. Now, are these giant-sized gold coins, in which case to Jack, they're larger than dinner plates, and he can sort of carry one and it's really heavy, or are they Jack-sized coins, and does the giant count them like grains of rice? So all of this for me is simply this level of, can you put yourself into the world of the story? Can you pull yourself down? And again, I do really weird research. I've spent a lot of time researching 17th century German currency because I set a lot of my stories in the Holy Roman Empire. And I had to figure out whether or not in the late 1800s we could still have potentially a 100-year-old gold coin. So, like, you do weird research, but all of this, right? It just to say, you don't have to, you just have to decide, right? And it can be generic, right? We are in generic medieval land. So we're using wood fire for heating, we're using candles or torches for lighting. If we push into the Renaissance, now we get a little better lamp lighting. We're doing a lot more off oil, right? Like, what does the image look like in your head? What does Cinderella's castle look like? Great. I don't care what time period that is, but put yourself into it. What does it feel like? What does that ballroom look like as you walk into it? There's a couple others here, and then we'll do the exercise. So really, for me, this first part is just pulling yourself into the world. Show, don't tell. Other things I can tell you about bringing stories to life. The more you can lose the words he said and she said, the better. This comes from Antonio Hosha. If two people are having a conversation, you as the storyteller should be able, with a shoulder shift, one person talks here, one person talks here. Antonio really likes one person lower than the other person. So one person is always looking up and one person is pretty straightforward, but his eyes are canted a little bit down. Someone can be a little beak, and it can just be a little tonal shift. I can get really old with just a little shift down. Most of my female characters are a little higher shifted in my register. I have some old guys with some pretty deep voices. It's not actually that much voice work. It's just a little switch for each character. But if my characters have a conversation, I don't need to say, and then Jack said, and then the giantess said, and then Jack said, and then the giantess said, hi, can I come in for dinner? Who are you? What are you doing here? It's all there, right? The more that we can bring into that. Voices and mannerisms are part of that. I fall into the category that I think that there are some people that like to overact. This does not need to be the drama on the Shakespeare stage and the ostensible skull playing Hamlet. But the more that you can have, who is that character? How do they hold themselves? Do they roll their, there's just a lot. I do a lot on Zoom, so I've thought a lot about my face and my shoulders, right? What does my shoulders rolled back and open just versus them crushed in look like? What does that tell me about these characters? Megan Wells really likes the shoulder profile. This is Megan being the Renaissance painting that Megan is, and she's going to tell you a story. So just even in the way you sit, the way you move your hands, all of that brings life into these characters. And then sharp focus on single moments. That the more, and this again, this is the setting us into the place in this scene. Now, and yes, sometimes like Jack has to years passed, Jack grew up. Then we get the next climbing of the beanstalk, right? It doesn't have to be moment by moment, but I would love to feel Jack sitting in the kettle watching the giant count gold, right? What does that look like? Can we be there? So now we come to the exercise. So I would like each of you to pick a fairy tale you know well, or a story you know well, really. Pick one interesting scene. If you are having any trouble choosing, the ball for Cinderella, Red meeting the wolf, Snow White being poisoned, pick a classic scene from a classic fairy tale. Pick one from the Disney and set yourself into that space. Take a moment to breathe. Set yourself into that space. What does that space look like? What time of year is it? What time of day is it? What is the quality of the light? What is the quality of the air? What is the smell that pervades? Um, how big is the space? If we're in a huge grand ballroom, that is a different experience than if we are in a really tight claustrophobic set of woodlands or a tunnel, right? What's the feeling of the space? What can you feel and what can you taste? Taste is often the hardest one because we don't think about what the air tastes like unless it's really weird. But also like what what does it feel like to walk in glass slippers? That's interesting. So with all of that, I don't need you to answer all of those questions, but I just want you to we're going to take a couple of minutes here, and I want you to write a description, 3 sentences. Doesn't need to be long. Remember, the description is often not the story, right? This is just getting us into the story so we can feel like we're there and we're brought into it, and then we can experience the story. But take a moment to write yourself a description. What does that scene feel like? And then I'm going to we're going to ask if there's anything interesting you found. So we're going to take 5 minutes and do that. I'm going to set myself a timer, and then we'll be back here in a minute. If you're still working, take a little while to bring yourself to a close. Hmm. All right, let's come back. If you're still in process and this was really interesting for you, there's a game to play. All right, we're going to come back here. Does anybody feel like they have something they would like to read aloud? And there's no pressure there. But if someone has something, I would love to hear a little bit of what someone wrote. And please don't tell me what story we're in. Paige, I think I saw your hand.
Yes, I'd be happy to share.
Lovely.
The apple is heavier than a normal apple. It takes more effort to throw and to catch. It doesn't feel waxy like you'd expect, but like the sculpture of an apple. It's just after the dawn. The sun has risen all the way above the horizon, but just barely. There's a slight chill in the air of the earth remembering how it felt before the sun rose. The grass is dewy and everything smells fresh and new. Until the troll sticks her head out of the window. She carries with her the smell of spoiled milk.
Hmm. Nice. How'd that feel?
That was very fun.
Great. And
Yeah.
so, I think probably what you feel there, that's a lot of exposition to get to a scene, but that like remembered what it felt like.
Mm-hmm.
Like there are, and what does is this sort of east of the sun, west of the moon in
Yes.
that world? Right.
Mm-hmm.
We have magic fruit that you open and there are magic things in. So do they feel like normal fruit?
Right.
And just even that when if someone even in the moment of being handed it, like I think it's the winds, it was heavier than an apple was, and it was a different texture, right? Just that much lets us know we're in this other world.
Yeah.
And give him an apple, give her an apple, right? Like, what is that? So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Does anybody else have one they would like to share? Megumi, am I pronouncing that right?
Okay. Here we go. My stepsisters were in agony. They'd taken so much laudanum for the pain that they were barely coherent. They tried to smile, and they looked ghastly. To staunch the bleeding, they'd bound their feet with strips of leather and cloth, but of course, when the prince walked in, our home reeked of laudanum and blood.
Wow. That's a whole different version of that story, right? Thank you. And so what I hope that did, and whether or not you take these and play with them, right? What does it mean to have cut off your heel? Like, that's intense. So, right, that smelled like laudanum and blood, right? Like that. I love that. So, in all of this, and this exercise can be played with any story you tell, even personal ones work great too. Any fairy or folk tale of personal stories you were there, at least I hope you were. Fairy and folk tales, set yourself there. I do a lot of if I'm setting a story historically, I do end up doing a lot of research about where one sources pearls in 17th century France. Nice is apparently the place that you do. The internet is a wild place. It's full of really interesting information if you dig deep enough. But just that little bit of what is the world you're in? Is this a world? Is this a Cinderella world of hoop skirts and bustles? Those change how you move, right? Cinderella used to wearing hoop skirt if she spent most of her life as a servant. Does she know how to move in one? What's that like? So the more that you can set yourself in the world, I think the more that we bring ourselves into these stories, the more that we can tell a story in a way that isn't just Cinderella went to the ball. What is it? What does glass sound like when it's tapping against stone walking upstairs? And you don't need all of the exposition. You don't have to do this with every single scene. That probably gets a lot. But the more to me that you can bring the scenes in, and the more that you can think about, is the wolf big? Is it emaciated? Is its fur smooth and sleek, or is it matted? Right, that changes the character of the wolf, and just that little bit begins to give us a sense of the story that we're in and where we are. So from here, the metaphor begins. How do we change the recipe? We might call this fracturing or twisting a fairy tale. And I would say that we start here with the story as our guide. The story must be our guide. Now, it is just enough to breathe life into a fairy tale. I had so much more fun than I thought telling Jack and the Beanstalk for our fairy tale variations. I told the original. It's not a story I've ever told before. And I had so much fun telling the original. That is such, like, just in the, what does it mean to climb up a beanstalk and look down at the world? What does it mean? Like, just that. How do you sell eggs made of gold without like destroying your local economy and having the king show up and wondering why, every market day you're selling what is a goose egg's worth of gold weigh? It's a lot of gold. So Jack's mother is really judicious and doesn't, like, she shaves off the gold. She doesn't want to get the law involved, right? So all of this, right? Like, what does that mean? So there are a couple of ways that I approach these stories. The first is to change the main character or point of view. What does it mean to tell a story where, and this is Wicked, which is now, in movie form, and he's come back in a big way. But I remember when the book came out and then the musical came out. What happens if we tell The Wizard of Oz with the Wicked Witch of the West being the main character? Really interesting things happen. What happens when we tell Cinderella when the stepsisters are the main characters? What happens? What's the story? Because with all of these stories, unless you go really far afield, your audience knows what story you're in, or should pretty quickly know what story you're in. And again, I think we can mostly trust that most children have seen Disney, right? What does it mean to take the stepsisters from Disney and turn them into interesting characters? I do personally a lot of first-person fairy tale. It's something I've sort of got myself pigeonholed doing, but I really like it. This started with a piece called The True Confessions of Prince Charming, which is Cinderella from the prince's perspective, because who's Prince Charming? He's a one-dimensional character with why on earth? So in the original Grimm's, he smears pitch on the steps of the castle to catch her shoes, because this is obviously the way to find her. So to me, that question really boiled down to, who is Prince Charming? And why doesn't he recognize her? He spent a night dancing, talking, laughing with this woman. Why doesn't he immediately know it wasn't her? And my prince explains, okay, I get asked this a lot. Why didn't I know it was her? Well, I will raise you. It was dark. She was wearing a wig and a mask. And I had a bottle of champagne on my own before we met. It's not so easy to recognize someone after a night like that. So, right, why doesn't he just recognize her? So, what does it mean to do first person? There's a Grimm story I do called Boots of Buffalo Leather, which is a king gets lost in the woods, meets a soldier. They run into a robber band's house. Soldier magic has random magic, freezes all the robbers. Hijinks ensue. I couldn't figure out how to do this story. The magic comes out of nowhere. There's no magic in this story until they're all sitting down and the soldier raises his glass and said, "To you all with your hands held high," and none of the men can move. And the only way I could figure out how to tell this story finally was first person from the king's perspective, and he is freaked out. He knows magic exists, but this is weird. It's a question you have to ask yourself. Is magic commonplace? How weird is magic to your people? The king feels like an electrical charge run down his shoulders, and the room gets cold, and then no one is moving. Creepy, right? What does it mean to be in that moment? So sometimes I tell that story very straight, but it's just a first person. Changing the setting. I just did a Puss in Boots set that I'm calling The Cat with No Name. It's set in Wyoming during, the 1890s. So Wild West Puss in Boots, because it was fun, and I love the idea of a cat in cowboy boots with a little cowboy hat. So just resetting the stories is often a classic. Wild West is a really easy place to transport a lot of these stories. Modern can be really fun. Sometimes you have to, solve the problem like, why didn't the prince just get Cinderella's number? I do a version of the Grimm's Bearskin. Its original name is The Devil in the Green Coat, set during Vietnam. Once upon a time, a young soldier returned to the shores of America from the jungles of Vietnam. And I set it during Vietnam, not during the Iraq-Afghanistan war, because I needed the characters not to have cell phones. Cell phones, I couldn't solve, it couldn't progress the way the story progressed if characters had cell phones. And I have many friends that came back from Afghanistan, very different people, and that's what I wanted to speak to. But Vietnam was the one that I could solve it. Also, it turned out that every character in that story smokes. So it's my story that helps people confront whether or not they still really want a cigarette. When do we learn what story we're in? How long does it take the audience to catch what story are we in? And that can be really fun, especially older grades, right? Like you don't want to wait till right to the end, but if you can bring them into a story and then have them realize, oh, this is Cinderella. I know where we're going. We always love that. I think if you can do it perfectly, I think the best detective fiction is where you figure it out one page before the detective has the parlor scene and tells everybody that the butler did it, right? You want to figure it out just before. You don't want to spend the whole book being like, I know who did it. Let's get there. But that if you can get your audience to realize what story they're in, and then that makes them all feel clever. They're all part of it. They're in it with you. Sympathy for the devil. I do a version of Cinderella from the stepmother's perspective. It occurs to me that if her daughters are of Cinderella's age, and she was married in her late teens or early 20s, she's in her early or mid 30s. As she says, hardly the gray-haired Hadron they all tried to paint me to be. And in that story began about how does the stepmother become the fairy godmother? That she comes into a house with a girl who is so in mourning for her mother, and there's this other woman here, and she hates her on sight. And the stepmother gets that. And so how does she care for a child that wants nothing to do with her? And so that you can, they don't have to be villains. A good anti-hero can be really fun, but what does it mean to, and here we're back at Wicked, right? Like, what is Wizard of Oz from the Wicked Witch's perspective? And so in this, how much can we change? The first question here is, how well does your audience know the original? I believe that we can generally trust that most people in the US know Disney, especially most kids. Now, it's interesting. Some of you could probably tell me this better because you work with children. In the age of streaming, I don't know how much this is still true. But, what are the fairy tales that your audience are aware of? And therefore, how much can you tweak the story and still have it not just become a completely new story? And how much does your story hinge on knowing the original? Especially if you're telling really short versions, you sort of expect your audience to be able to fill in the gaps because they know the story. But how much do you have to feed them about who's the Wicked Queen and why is Snow White named Snow White and. There's a thing here about common versus uncommon fairy tales. There is, if most of you, unless you've heard it from me or Liz Weir, have never encountered a story called Kathleen and the Greyhound Husband, we're the only two storytellers that I know that tell that story. My version is something that is a derivative version between the version she sent me and the original, which is called The Three Daughters of King O'Hara, which is from 1890. And then I wrapped in, the ending has three children that we have a classic, a hart in a duck and a salmon and a ram stuck in a tree kind of how you hide your heart. And then I sort of brought in a little bit of the Bear of Green Glen. So I'm definitely already pastiching the story a little bit. And so if you have only heard my version and you go back and read the original, it's going to be a little weird. You're going to think, that's not the story Cooper told me. And you especially find this as stories mature and get worked through the literary process. And this is one of the reasons that I suggest you go back and you find really old versions and weird versions. And then you start saying, okay, what do I like from here? What do I like from here? What do I like? What's the common thread? Because it's going to become your story, but no one reads my version of Kathleen as a variant. They read it as Kathleen because it's the only time they've ever heard that story. So if you're taking really big liberties with a story, my opinion is often just rename it. Say this is based on X, as opposed to this is obviously X, and then they get there and they're like, this is A plus C, not X. Forget X. So, in the digging into the story, into how do we change the recipe, and this exercise also works really well for a story that you tell straight as well. How do we find the thing that speaks to you? Why do you want to tell this story? And sometimes the answer is you're doing fairy tale variations, Jack and the Beanstalk, and no one is telling the traditional one, so you have to do it. Great, I had to do it. Sometimes it's because you read a story and something jumped out at you. Something felt, and oftentimes, at least it's hard for me to name. I'm like, this story means something for me. There's something here I want, but I can't tell you what it is. And so in this, how do we dig down to find that thing? And to me, so again, Prince Charming, who is Prince Charming? Why doesn't he recognize her? That whole story is built around answering those two questions. The whole story is built finding the answers to those two questions. And so when we come into these stories, what speaks to you? And so we're going to play another game. This exercise comes from Janice Del Negro. I love it. I have stolen it. This is the fairy tale haiku. So haiku in the very Americanized form, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. Now, if syllables are hard, 5 words, 7 words, 5 words. I don't care about it particularly. But what I don't want you to try to tell me a story in, 17 syllables or words. I want you to tell me the most important thing in that story. I want you to tell me what is interesting to you in that story. So we're going to again take probably now about 4 minutes. Don't overthink it. Don't overthink the syllable counting. The syllable is to give you a box to play in. If you choose to play outside of the box, you've chosen to play outside of the box. Great. So again, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, 5 words, 7 words, 5 words. Tell me a moment in the story. What is important? When I say Little Red Riding Hood, what is the haiku that you write of Little Red Riding Hood? When I say Cinderella, what is the haiku you write of Cinderella? Stories are, of course, your own choices. So have it. All right, give yourself a little bit longer to bring it to a close. Doesn't have to be complete. Doesn't have to be perfect. It's just an exercise. If you really love it, you can go back and work on it later. You can write a whole story about it later. So give yourself a moment to bring that to a close and bring yourselves back. Still see some heads down. All right. Again, does anybody want to share? Sorry, anybody? I can pick on someone like it's middle school. Karen, Culver.
Rats, rats everywhere you see. If you want to keep your kids, better pay the piper's fee.
And it rhymes.
I confess I took Janice's workshop as well.
Huh?
And at that time she said to do it to the tune of row, row, row,
Row
your boat.
boat. Right. I am so bad at that I cannot ask anyone to do that. I remember I sat there, I was like, I can't. So I
But
just
I
do
love the row, row, row your boat. And I did about 10 of them, so.
I love it. I love it. Anybody else? Mary, is that I'm saying great?
Asked to measure love, no answer would satisfy. Banished, then brought home.
Meat like salt, love like salt.
That's my signature story.
Oh, I love that story. I love that story. And so we don't, if this was a much longer workshop, and I've done this workshop as a 3-part workshop, what I would ask is for the next workshop is that you take whatever you just did and write 100-word story. And then I would ask you to write a 200-word story. So each time growing it, but even with 100 words, right? That's like a minute and a half maybe of spoken word. What can you say in 100 words? You can't tell the whole story in 100 words. So what do you want to talk about if all you have is 100 words? What do you want to talk about if all you have is 17 syllables or 17 words? And so that moment, to me, it really lets us focus in. Don't judge the quality of these. I mean, if you write haiku, please, I love good haiku, but this is just a work. This is just an exercise. This is an exercise to say, what is the thing that matters? Why does this matter? And then that, to me, gives you a place that you can start to go. You can focus that as you write the story, that to me is the thing that you are answering. That is the question you are answering. The girl gave the wrong question, wrong answer, and she was banished. How does she come back? What does that resolution look like? What does it mean that the rats are literally potentially eating your children? That's intense. My version of the Pied Piper was about the crippled boy that still hears the music, and he can never get rid of the music out of his head because he couldn't catch them. Turned out to be a story about addiction. I did not think the Pied Piper was going to be a story about addiction. So all of these, right? My first version of the first time I worked on Sleeping Beauty, for me, it was all about consent. That how do I do this story where the prince is weirded out as much as she is that he has to kiss her, or it's the original Grimm's where he just walks in the room and she wakes up, right? What is that? What is that world of consent? So in all of this, there is this other path that we can take. And if we were doing this in a much longer way, I usually do Cinderella because Cinderella's got a whole bunch of these. I would recommend that as you play this and as you dig into these stories, you go back and read the originals. But you actually read them. A lot of us were really good at skimming. We skim really fast, especially when we're like going through fairy tale books, right? Like what's cool, what's good, what's good. Go back and read it and see where you go, huh? Cinderella asks her father for a twig from the first tree that knocks his hat off on his way home. I don't know what that's about, but exploring that question gave me the story, Call Me the Villain If You Like, which is Cinderella from the stepmother's perspective, was exploring that question. Also for me is, who's the prince? Who is this guy? Why doesn't he recognize her? Snow White is how old? I had to write a story. I had to answer that. I had to make some answer to the fact that she's 7. Now, again, I tell to an adult audience. But even then, what does it mean that your stepmother ordered you murdered when you were between 12 and 16, right? What does that mean? How do you answer that? And so these, to me, is one of my favorite ways of just what matters to you in the story. What jumps out at you? The haiku is one way to do it. Reading the originals and seeing what slaps you in the head is the other way to do it for me. And then that, to me, is the answer. That's where you begin to work the story. And as you do it, it's to breathe life into it. It's to make, what does it mean to have a city that is literally, the streets are so swarming with rats that you cannot let your children walk out your door. First of all, it smells. So there. Lastly, in all of this, I just do want to say, right, that sometimes there are parts of a fairy tale that don't work. If I'm telling Snow White to children, we are not talking about that in the original, she's 7. She's going to be in her mid-teens at youngest, right? That I'm not going there. The story of King Thrushbeard, which is Taming of the Shrew, the Grimm's version, King basically gaslights and abuses his wife until she's making money. I don't know what to do with that story. I don't like telling it straight. I know that. Again, Janice Del Negro, my good friend, says that sometimes stories just deserve to die natural deaths. That isn't to say I think that they should be purged from the canon. I'm just saying I've never heard someone tell King Thrushbeard in a way that I've enjoyed listening to. If someone can, I'm all ears. I want to hear that story. I want to see that story redeemed. I love the weird, dark stories getting redeemed. But some stories you just don't want to tell. And that's okay. But if you are being asked for whatever reason to tell King Thrushbeard, what do you tweak? What do you change? Are they both in on it? Right? Like, what do you do to play that? Sleeping Beauty, can the prince acknowledge that this is weird? He doesn't like this. And then she wakes up and you're like, who are you? And why are you in my bedchamber? And I've never seen the fashion that you're wearing, because she's dressed like his great-great-grandmother, right? Like, what can we acknowledge? Can the characters be real? They can be tweaked and they can be fixed. And then we return to, what is the most important part of the story? What is the thing you're trying to answer? And if I didn't know that Megan had a version, I'll need to find that. Thank you. Thank you, Priscilla. Returning for me then to that, what is that most important part? And if to me, the most important part is answering Snow White's age, I can't change that. But if I do a version of Snow White, which is a love letter to Colorado, because we have an immigrant fairy from Cornwall called a Tommyknocker, which is a mining fairy. And when I wrote that story, that story was about, what if the dwarves are Tommyknockers, and everything had to fit around that. Had to fit that Caribou, Colorado had a 60% Cornish population in 1864. So that's where it was set. Everything fit around fitting it into this story of Tommyknockers. She's in her early 20s because that's how old she is. That's how old she needed to be. So that was a lot of words that I just threw at you all. We got to do a little bit of exercises. We have about 10 minutes left, and I'm happy to stick around a little bit longer if people want to keep talking or want to hear me keep talking. But at this point, do you have questions? What in here do you want more of? What didn't make sense? Oh, is there anything you are interested in me talking about? I can keep rambling about fairy tales, but you've all been so lovely and great. But at this point, is there anything, questions, comments, what can I offer you in the little bit of time we have left? And you're welcome to just unmute yourself or write into the chat, or where there's a little raise hand option, I think, under the react button. However you want. It's a small enough group, so. Or we could all just go home. Megumi.
So my question is, if the audience doesn't know the folktale, and you have to fill in what they don't know, it's hard to do the twisted stories or a different ending.
Yes.
So it's difficult, but are you saying it's doable?
So, great. So if we are taking a folktale that your normal audience doesn't know, doesn't have a reference point for, first, to answer the first bit of your question there, this to me is part of the more within the telling of the story you can answer the questions that they might have. If this is set in a we all culturally in America, we have an understanding of what fairy tale land looks like. Sort of Renaissance European, most of the people are white. If you are telling a story tale from India, or fairy tale from India, or a folk tale from Japan, or whatever you are choosing to tell it from, the more that you can give and this is that setting the scene. What does the air feel like? What are the colors the people are wearing? What are they eating? And the little bits that you can fit in there, first of all, to set the place and the tone of it. And then, if you are going to change it, and again, the folk process, you can change stories. The more that it can feel like it is the same story, that change doesn't come out of nowhere. In a patriarchal society, most of our folktales come from an older, more conservative system. A girl just declaring that she's not going to marry who her father has picked for her, and everybody just sort of shrugging and being okay with that, that's weird. But in that, you don't have to have her marry the man her father has chosen for her to marry, if that's the way the story ends and you don't like that. But having it be a struggle, how do they accomplish that within the confines of the world in which they live, right? That the more that we tell the story and we build up what the world that we're in, if we begin to change that world, then the audience says, but wasn't it that way? And so I would say that to change it is to keep it within the construct of the world that you've built. And I will say, and this is depending on your audience level, right? Like third graders probably don't care. If I'm going to tell that, if I'm telling in this group of people, I would say, this is an Egyptian folktale. I call it The Black Queen. You will hear some of Laura Sims' version of this story in mine, because that's where I learned the story from. She calls it The Black Prince. The farthest back I can trace that story is 1971 in a book called The Black Prince and Other Egyptian Folktales by Zain Zergould. I've asked a lot of Egyptian storytellers and no one knows the reference for this, so I don't know if they wrote it. They promote it as a folktale. I have gender swapped it. I have taken this liberty with it. Or I might even say, I've gone my own way with the ending of this story. And if this is a story you're interested in telling, come talk to me and I'll show you what the original was. Does that answer the question?
I'll chew on what you said.
Okay.
Yeah, I have to work that out. Thank you.
Karen Culver.
Yeah, I know what along that line, when you talk about the folk process, Cooper, I think of the oral tradition and storytellers from eons ago retelling the same, what we're now calling originals in terms of folk tales. They have embellished or made them their own, but they didn't fracture them or twist them too much, or different perspectives. And I see that as a separate thing than fractured fairy tales, since they are more literary. But since I tell to young children, I always like to tell the classic or original versions so that when they read the fractured tales, they get the sense, they understand the humor of those.
Yes. And I love that you're telling the originals. I again, most of my audience is fairy tale literate. I do shows based on, we do an original and then we do 4 variants. And I do think that little kids is one thing. I know some friends that do some first person and resetting of fairy tales, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, where they've been told the original. They've heard someone tell it. They have a place to reference from. So when my buddy tells I forget what it's called. It's Cinderella. It's Cowboy Cinderella. It's great, and it's his magic fairy god pig, and it's just, I love the fairy god pig.
Probably Cinderfella.
I forget what Wynn calls it. Anything? Eva. Eva.
You had it right the first time. Yeah. I'm in Seattle, and I'm wondering, the original question was, how do we tell a story? I'm sorry if we're running out of time.
No, you're fine.
That when the people don't know the story, and you answered that, but I'm thinking now is, are kids today really getting the stories that previous generations got?
Right. And I don't know if I can answer that. I mostly don't tell the children. So if there are those of you in the audience that have information about this, please, I would be fascinated to know. I do know some folks that will tell an original and then tell a fractured back to back. That says, what if we tell this, and then what if we tell it from the bad guy's perspective, right? And that you can introduce the one that you're about to play with if that's something you want to do. But again, this goes into who's your audience, and that is a fascinating question.
Well, thank you. I have one more question.
Please.
And this is Eva again.
Mm-hmm.
About the fairy tale variations.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if that you can sign up for that, if it's going to be recorded and aired at a different time if you can't make that evening.
Yes, all of the virtual shows that I do are recorded. Fairy Tale Variations is a week from tomorrow a week from Saturday. Tomorrow's Friday. A week from Saturday, 6 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, so wherever that is for you. We do record all of our shows. If you register for the shows, you are sent a link to the recording. This is a big asterisk. This was one of the things that was really weird early Zoom world, was what do you do with the recording? And one of the things I talk to people, if you're doing any virtual storytelling, think about what you want to do with the recording before someone asks you the question, because someone is going to ask you the question. But yes, we do. Megumi, I saw that you unmuted yourself there. Did you have an answer to Eva's question?
No, I want to just echo what you said about saying the original or the most classic or the most available version. And then, yeah, I led some adults and they did not know even Three Little Pigs. So this is people who are imprisoned, so they've had troubled backgrounds. So we can't just assume they know.
Right.
But they were excellent at making fractured tales from
Anyone else? Sorry, I'm trying to see if. Bessie.
Hi. I think it's important that you have some feel of whether your audience has any idea, because I was in a remote town and a professional storyteller came through and told a long story, which would have been hilarious, about Naugahyde and how the little Naugas are raised, etc. And it should have been funny, but nobody in the audience had ever heard of Naugahyde. And another good friend of mine was telling in an area that was unfamiliar to her, and she does the Little Rotten Hut, and it's all real words, and that kind of thing.
Yep.
And they're looking at her like they had no, she was just up there talking gibberish. So I think it's important to at least feel out ahead of time before you do too drastic. Just advice.
No, I absolutely agree. And I'm sorry, this has come up a couple of times here, so I need to put that in here. Knowledge of where your audience is really important, and that ability to read an audience and say, and also just one of the things I love about fairy tales is I can stop and talk to the audience, right? Does anybody here know what Nagahide is? If you're telling a story, I would have something. This is Nagahide, right? This is like you can explain it, right? In the theater world of that fourth wall, we don't have that in storytelling. Even the first person stuff that I do, I am telling a story in first person, but you're all still here, right? Whether it's your little Zoom boxes or whether I'm in a theater, I know you're here. I'm not pretending you're not here. If a train goes by Jonesboro, right, we all stop and be quiet because it's loud, right? That there's that level, right, that even if you're really deep in a really intense, long story, I've had people ask questions during the middle of a story, and I figure, all right, I'm probably going to answer, right? Like that, and also in that way of, I think, what's the quote? Out from the mouths of babes come truth. Any questions you were asked by children is probably something that needs to be fixed to the story. Now, some children are terrible and just want to ask weird questions, but that level of if children are confused by your story, you might have missed something. And I love a child calling me out. One of my favorite ones. What was the girl's name? I'm like, everyone in that story has a name but the love interest. Right? Go fix that, Cooper. So,
Okay.
Alicia?
Alicia? Cooper, are you okay?
Okay.
Yes.
Hello. My name is Alicia Tungju. I'm from South Korea. So thank you for teaching all of us. First of all, I'm the director of Korea International Storytelling Festival. That's why I'm just think about different aspect. I'm a cultural storytelling curator. So fairy tale is a great opportunity to learn about different cultures, I think. I want to bring the kind of workshops like this to children to let them discover stories from around the world and create their own twist. And for example, in Korea, there's a different versions. Cinderella story, as a main character is a man, it's a boy, and that's why very interesting. And that's why I think, what do you think about this idea?
I do not know if I am the right person for that, but I would love to chat with you if you're interested in talking about that. I know I have never done this, but I know people that have had really good English. I'm talking. I'm being paid to talk. Really good results walking children through how do we play with the stories and make them ours. How do we write the story and how do we fracture it and how do we change it so it becomes ours? It usually requires a little bit more work because at that time they're often just receiving stories. And that idea, I did it as at that age. I've got nieces and nephews that do it, right? That they're writing stories. And sometimes those stories have all of our popular culture characters in them. But how do you take one and say, what do we do with this? I think it's a really powerful thing. And I agree. Fairy tales are a really, really interesting lens into a culture. So if you are interested, I would be happy to talk with you. If I'm not the right person, I'd be happy to send you see who I could send in your direction.
예, 감사합니다.
Means thank you in Korean. Thank you, Cooper, for staying later than ending time. And thank you, everybody, to coming to this Yes Story Lab. Cooper, you are fantastic. Everybody loved it. It was so helpful. Thank you so much. And uh, we're gonna have another Yes Story Lab hopefully before the end of the December. So hope you can come. And thank you again, Cooper, and thank you everybody to come here. Gonna
Yeah.
yes. Have a great night, and I'm gonna stop the recording now. Whoosh. Okay.
Thank you all so much for coming.